Well, I thought there was an opportunity last evening to speak and address the issue of infrastructure, and I thought that the president was long on generalizations and short on specifics. I also thought devoting but 3 sentences to the opiate addiction crisis that confronts America, when you consider that there are 2 million people who are now sidelined from the economy because they formerly went to work and they don't any longer because of the addiction that they have. I was hoping that there would be more of a specific proposal from the administration declaring not only is this a national emergency, but putting sufficient resources behind it to make sure that we address it. In addition, I thought that on the issue of immigration, that the president missed the moment. I think that he talked about bipartisanship in the early stages of the speech and then more or less offered an edict as opposed to compromise and agreement on the path forward. If I could just alert the media to the people that do the follow-up with you. The largest problem that we have with the undocumented in America does not come from those who crossed the Mexican border. It comes from people who have come here on holiday visa and they have overstayed the visa, meaning they simply have not returned. So I would have anticipated that there would have been an opportunity to find a compromise, understanding that not only is this an issue about the dreamers, but there's a long line of individuals who have applied for immigration to regularize their status, and it's a 5-year wait now. So I hope that there's some room here in the next few weeks to see if we can't do more of a comprehensive approach to immigration reform. I think that you could speak to the generalizations that he offered, but I think that in part of what he was suggesting last night included recrimination, and I think that that is not helpful to the dialogue. Well, I was pleased that he at least raised the issue of a significant infrastructure proposal across the country, and to suggest that it could be north of $1.5 trillion, I think is an acknowledgement of reality. Our highways, our roadways, our airports, our bridges, and our water and sewer systems in many cases are not just antiquated, but they are inefficient, creating lapses in productivity gain. And I think that anybody has had a chance to travel to a European airport, for example, you would quickly see just how sophisticated the rest of the world has become in terms of their infrastructure investments. So I'm still hopeful on that basis side that we might be able to find some sort of common path forward. Well, I mean, generally the administration takes the lead on that by offering a series of proposals. And last night, even though the president highlighted the idea of $1.56 trillion, I think when his advisors were specifically asked, they were asking for a greater role from states and localities. That probably is a non-starter, given the fact that I think federal highway maintenance and administration is a federal responsibility.
So you're talking about federal spending, actually spending taxpayer dollars on infrastructure versus what the Republicans suggested being like tax credits, right?
That's exactly right. I think that this needs to be treated as an investment, and investments for all of us, we acknowledge, whether it's purchasing a home or purchasing a car or purchasing a college education, these have long-term consequences. So you don't pay them off immediately, but understanding that greater efficiencies, greater increases in productivity, they make for greater economic gains. I noticed that.
Democrats sitting on their hands. What was your take on that? Did you expect so much Republican response?
I've seen the changes that have taken place in the State of the Union address. It's important to remember that it was Lyndon Johnson who moved it to prime time. But then I think that the changes became pronounced during the administration of President Ronald Reagan. And I think that President Reagan was the first to begin to invite guests into the chamber, in the balconies, for the purpose of reinforcing the message that was being delivered. So I think in my time, the optics have taken on more of an entertainment value as opposed to an information value, and how the speech is presented seems to be the one that is more carefully panned by the pundits. But in addition, I also think that one of the challenges now that you have with this is that it's more about the applause lines. And it's to look at what happens in polling over the course of the next week, and then the polling will settle back after there's a bit of a bump, perhaps.
Are you optimistic that the Democrats and Republicans can work in a more bipartisan manner this coming year to get some of these plans passed and some of this legislation?
I think that it is becoming increasingly difficult, given the hardening realities that have occurred across America. And I think that it's important to remember that one of the reasons that it's so difficult to get things done in Washington is because the American people are very much divided as to how they see the path forward. And I think that continuing to scratch the emotions of people on issues that really are part of a narrow slice really need to be put to the side while we try to get on to some of these bigger issues. It's very different than the Congress I signed up for, I can assure you of that. We were really of the opinion that effectiveness was supposed to be more important than ideological purity.
Congressman Neal, any thoughts on the midterm elections and expectations of the Democrats in terms of the House and Senate?
You have now 7 Republican chairmen in the House who have decided to retire. And that, I think, in and of itself is an indication that it is going to be a wobbly election season for Republicans going into November. In addition, there are 40 Republicans who have retired. And let's face it, it's always easier to capture an open seat than it is to beat an incumbent.
Congressman, what do you think about FEMA pulling out of Puerto Rico, and how might that impact Western Massachusetts as a likely place to receive some of those refugees?
Well, I'm disappointed that they're leaving, and the complaints from the Puerto Rican government are apparent. And I think that until Congress passes disaster relief for Puerto Rico, they should stay. In addition to which, I thought much of the good work that FEMA has done on the ground, providing shelter and food for people that are in dire straits. And I'm hopeful that as part of this budget agreement that is now awaiting negotiation, that we can get the money to Puerto Rico, Texas, Louisiana, and those who are in need. That's, by the way, the national principle at work. If there's a problem in California or Alabama or Puerto Rico or a tornado in Springfield, we come to the aid of the people that have been most impacted. I saw Congressman Kennedy's response. I thought it was well done. I thought it was very well done. I thought the site selection was impressive, and I thought that his ability to have his constituents witness his work was exceedingly important. Yeah. I called him this morning to congratulate him for what I thought was a pretty good performance.
Do you think that's an effective message to the Democrats? When I raised questions about the midterm elections, is that the effective message that we don't need this zero-sum game, we embrace everybody?
Well, I think you raise a good question, because I think the economics that need to be addressed sometimes are pushed to the side by some of the cultural differences that we have in the American family. When the president said last night, for example, that the stock market has been going up the way that it has, he didn't say that it's been going up since March of 2009. When the president said last night that economic growth is unparalleled, President Obama's 14.3 million jobs that were created during his watch certainly at the moment supersedes the 2 million jobs that were created during the first year of the Trump administration. And just as a factoid, which I think is important to call attention to, when the president described last evening the job growth, he went back to the day he was elected, not to the day he was inaugurated, which was almost 2.5 months later. And I think that when you consider, for example, that this economy has been repairing for 89 straight months, 9 years of straight economic growth. I think that that needed to be highlighted, as opposed to this idea that if you just dismantle America's healthcare system and then complain that it's broken, I think that there was a moment when the president could have uplifted all of our aspirations.
I know you obviously don't like to have issues be super partisan and rather work together. What are you looking forward to on Trump's agenda for this new year that you
You should remember that at one time, infrastructure was the easiest legislation to pass, that Republicans and Democrats found common purpose and common ground on the need to continually invest in America's long-term needs. The fact that that is now stalled and that we haven't done a major infrastructure initiative in a long period of time, and remember the last offering, it was based on borrowing money from the Federal Reserve Board rather than doing the sort of long-term investment that is necessary. And my hunch here is that there is a broad acknowledgement privately on the Republican side that we need to do a big infrastructure bill. And my understanding is that Gary Cohn is going to lay out specifics over the course of the next 2 weeks, and we'll have a chance at that time, I think, to respond to them. I'm also going to be highlighting a meeting that I'm going to have with local legislators to start putting in place priorities for central and western Massachusetts. So remember that the Federal Highway Administration and the federal government, we would parcel out the remedy for this lack of, I think, enthusiasm for infrastructure in terms of investment, and then the money would flow to the state as it always does. But I think that being prepared now for those eventualities is a sound public measure.
And then on the flip side of that, was there anything in particular that stood out to you last night that you really hope that you don't have to work on this year?
Well, I think the idea that that the tax cuts were praised last night the way that they were neglects the reality that over 10 years we are borrowing $2.3 trillion to give tax relief to people at the very top in American life. The idea that that top rate is being cut from 39.6% to 37% is not about the middle class. The idea that the exemption on the estate tax is being doubled from $11 million to $22 million is not middle class tax relief. And I think that that was a substantially missed opportunity given the fact that there were no public hearings and that the entire revenue structure of the United States was upended in 5 weeks.
A similar question about bipartisanship with regards to your guest, Sheriff Cochee.
Yeah.
Speak a little bit about maybe that choice and what we can expect at the local level.
Well, I thought that the sheriff was an appropriate guest because whether we care to acknowledge it or not, one of the challenges that sheriffs and those who do law enforcement have, they tend to end up with the result. And Sheriff Cochee has said a number of times, and it's been reinforced by Sheriff Bowler and others that I've worked with, that 90% of the inmates at their facilities either have a drug or alcohol problem. So I know the sheriff is in the midst of developing what I think are some pretty exciting alternatives to just incarceration. And I thought last night that the president highlighted the idea that we have to do a better job of getting those who have been incarcerated back into the mainstream of economic life. I mean, labor markets are very tight. And I think that on the opiate front, everybody knows a family member, a friend, a neighbor down the street that has the problem. And I think that the overextension of opiate prescriptions has also compounded the problem.
Did the president, I mean, I know going into last night's speech, there wasn't a great deal of problems and some random like parts of the discussion, but anything last night to change that?
I think that the reality of modern politics now means that there's more of a play to the base of the two parties, forgetting that the electorate is generally very different than the early stage of a campaign. And I think that there was a chance last night for the president to have really used the moment as a unifying principle. After all, he had an hour and a half last night to have a one-way conversation with the American people. And I thought that the tepid applause that you had on our side, which was polite and courteous, but not embracing.